You know, they called it the war to end all wars. But World War I, it did anything but. It was this global catastrophe that didn't just kill millions. It literally toppled empires, redrew the map of the world as we know it, and introduced a kind of horror and warfare that nobody had ever seen before. So today, we're going to break down how one single gunshot in Sarajevo could spiral into a conflict that claimed so many lives, and whose aftershocks, believe it or not, we still feel today. Let's dig into how it all went so horribly wrong. I mean, listen to that. Back in the summer of 1914, that quote just perfectly captures the mood. All across Europe, you had crowds cheering in the streets, waving flags as their boys marched off to war. There was this genuine feeling of excitement, a sense of adventure and patriotic duty. The common thinking was, hey, this is going to be quick, it's going to be glorious. They were literally told they'd be home before the leaves fall, or, the most famous one, over by Christmas. Well, they were tragically, horribly wrong. This is the brutal reality. 20 million. That's the estimated number of people, soldiers and civilians, who died in the Great War. So all that initial excitement, that naive patriotism, it just dissolved into 4 straight years of unimaginable slaughter. This was no glorious adventure. It was an industrial-scale tragedy. So, how on earth did this happen? How did the world just stumble into a catastrophe of this magnitude? The thing is, the assassination of an archduke, as shocking as it was, wasn't the real cause. It was just the spark. The spark that lit a continent that was already basically a giant powder keg, just waiting to explode. A continent filled with rivalries, intense nationalism, and a whole bunch of really complicated military pacts. And this is the key to understanding it all. This crazy web of alliances was like a series of tripwires stretched all across Europe. All the major powers were tangled up in these 2 opposing teams. You had the Allied powers, that's Britain, France, and Russia, and then the Central powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary. And these treaties meant that a fight between just 2 of them could and absolutely would drag everybody else into the war. And boy, did those dominoes fall fast. It was just stunning. After the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was shot, it kicked off this chain reaction of threats and mobilizations that triggered all those alliances we just talked about. I mean, look at the timeline. In just over a month, a regional crisis in the Balkans just exploded into a full-blown European war, pulling in one great power after another. So, those soldiers who marched off thinking of glory, they expected a war like the ones in the history books, right? A war of movement, of heroic cavalry charges and quick, decisive victories. But what they found waiting for them was something else entirely. Something new, something terrifying. A kind of warfare that would come to define the very meaning of horror for an entire generation. This comparison pretty much says it all. The dream of a short, heroic war just slammed headfirst into the reality of trench warfare. Instead of zipping across battlefields, there was stalemate. Instead of glory, there was mud, disease, and the constant mind-shattering terror of artillery shells exploding all around you. That promise of being home by Christmas? Yeah, that became a 4-year nightmare with no end in sight. Just try to picture it. A massive scar, 400 miles long, carved right across the face of Europe, from the mountains of Switzerland all the way to the North Sea. That was the Western Front. And for 4 long years, millions of men lived, fought, and died in this disgusting network of ditches. In battles you've probably heard of, like the Somme and Verdun, hundreds of thousands were killed just to gain a few yards of blasted, worthless mud. And the conflict didn't just stay in Europe. Oh no, it quickly spiraled outwards, pulling in empires and nations from all over the globe. And it was all fueled by deadly new technologies that made the act of killing more brutally efficient than ever before. It really did become a true world war. You had nations like Japan joining the Allies, while the Ottoman Empire sided with the Central Powers, and you had colonial troops from Africa, India, Canada, Australia, all fighting and dying in Europe and the Middle East. It was a genuinely global conflict. And the technology of the time just changed everything. A single machine gun could mow down hundreds of charging soldiers in minutes. Artillery could rain down death from miles away, without you ever seeing the enemy. They even developed poison gas, a whole new kind of silent chemical terror. And here's the crucial part. These new weapons made it way, way easier to defend a trench than to attack one. And that's the main reason for those years and years of bloody stalemate. For years, the war was just this brutal, bloody deadlock.
a meat grinder. But then came 1917, and in that 1 year, two huge, monumental events happened on opposite sides of the world almost at the same time. And together, they would completely change the course of the war and basically seal the fate of the Central Powers.
Okay, so first, Russia completely collapsed from the inside. The Bolshevik Revolution overthrew the Tsar, and the new government's first order of business was to pull Russia right out of the war. Now, this was a massive win for Germany, right? It freed up nearly 1 million of its soldiers to move from the Eastern Front over to the West to launch one last gigantic offensive. But Germany's big gamble totally backfired. Their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant sinking any ship, including civilian American ones, and a secret telegram they sent to Mexico, basically provoked the United States into finally declaring war. And this brought millions of fresh American troops and the full power of American industry into the fight on the Allied side, and that was the ballgame. So, with American help, that final German push failed, and the Central Powers just collapsed one after another. The fighting was finally over. But the peace that came next, well, it was fragile, it was messy, and it was deeply flawed. And it created a legacy that would, ironically, pave the way for an even deadlier war. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. The war was over. But the world was just shattered. 4 massive empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman, were just gone, wiped off the map. And an entire generation of young men had been decimated. And just look at these numbers. This gives you just a tiny glimpse of the staggering human cost in military deaths alone. For countries like France and Germany, we're talking about nearly a whole generation of young men just gone. These aren't just statistics. They represent millions of broken families and a trauma that would haunt Europe for decades. And this, right here, is the war's most bitter irony. The peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, was supposed to make sure a war like this never happened again. But it did the opposite. It forced Germany to accept all the blame, the famous war guilt clause, and pay crippling reparations. And this deep national humiliation created this well of resentment that, as we all know, leaders like Adolf Hitler would later tap into, leading directly to World War II. So the war to end all wars really ended nothing. It just hit the reset button, setting the stage for the 20th century's even bigger conflicts. It tore down old empires, but created all these new tensions that have shaped the world we live in today. Its legacy is just this stark reminder of how quickly patriotism can turn into tragedy, and how a bad peace can be even more dangerous than the war itself.